All right. Well, it looks like we're right at noon. Let's get started. Let others trickle in. I'm expecting at least a few more. We'll see. But welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's Monadnock Broadband Group meeting. For those of you who haven't joined past meetings, the Monadnock Broadband Group is an informal coalition of municipal officials, stakeholders, practitioners, and others interested in coordinating relative to broadband issues in Southwest New Hampshire. I am Henry Underwood, planner here at Southwest Region Planning Commission in Keene. My colleague Todd Horner is here as well. He'll speak in a little bit. Other than that, we won't do complete introductions. I know many of you know each other already, but I encourage you to introduce yourselves via the chat, and adjust your name as needed in your participant list in case it's something that changes between meetings. So very briefly, last time the Monadnock Broadband Group met was a little less than 2 months ago. Really had a packed agenda, and we're fortunate enough to have some really interesting presentations from Michael Jansen of the FCC, as well as Rob Coster and others from Consolidated Communications. Also heard about some really notable legislative items, both in our state and federal proposed legislation to watch this session. And I just want to thank everyone who could participate in those discussions last time. For the purpose of today's meeting and some context, partly it's about timing. By our count, about 11 communities in our region, plus a couple more outside of our region, have broadband infrastructure bond articles already passed or being considered this year. And the logical next step to that is working out an agreement or a contract with the internet service provider selected by that community. So kind of between the last meeting and now, I've had some phone calls and emails. Hey, could there be a Monadnock Broadband Group meeting dedicated to this topic? And I said, well, I'll ask. So I sent out the email. There was a positive response to the idea of an agenda focused on those agreements or contracts. So this meeting is somewhat different than past meetings, somewhat of an experiment, because we're going to be dedicated to that one topic, more or less. And to be clear, we're the Planning Commission staff, aren't here as legal counsel or experts in negotiation. You can't consider this meeting like a replacement for municipal local counsel in these negotiations. This is really just an open discussion to air some common questions that have come up, and it's going to require that everyone participate and help out in that. What we did do is kind of get things in order for the meeting like we normally do, and I'll act as a timekeeper, somewhat facilitator when I need to, and get us kind of lined up to start talking about the topics of interest, which are on page 2 of the agenda. We'll get to that shortly. The other item we did to prepare for the meeting was to ask folks to submit relevant materials in advance that somehow related to this. I've made those available on the Monadnock Broadband Group webpage, which I can't find. Here we go. The link that says meeting resources includes, for example, a portion of the RING agreement for folks to look at. Thank you to Tim Wessels for getting permission to share that. All right, so before I guess we kind of develop and attack that list of discussion topics, did want to spend a couple minutes sharing a couple of notable broadband resources, partly as recognizing that many attendees are actually fairly new along this process. Maybe they're not actually quite this far along yet this year, but maybe they'll be looking at next year to make this progress. And also that it's I think it's a notable opportunity even for the veterans who are ready to go with these agreements that just kind of be aware of past work. So I'll introduce a couple and then I'll turn to my colleague Todd to introduce the last one. Refer to this handout here, which is again posted with the meeting materials, on our webpage for this meeting. Just a couple of resources for folks to consider. Again, if you're new or you just want to kind of go back and be reminded of some of the issues that have come up before. The first resource to bring up is work done by the state to develop a state broadband plan. Partly that was an aggregation of the regional broadband plans that we participated in, others in, and wrapped up in 2015. What you can find at the UNH webpage is not only access that state planning document of priorities, things towns and others should consider when improving broadband, but also some of the other work that they continue to do in other parts of the region. For example, some work dedicated on cable franchise agreements. So I encourage you to kind of revisit this UNH page. In particular, all the way at the bottom here, that 2015 report is there. Great way to get up to speed about broadband needs and issues. And again, they have some more up-to-date resources there as well. The second item, getting closer to us, what's unique to us, Southwest New Hampshire's broadband plan, which was adopted by our board in 2015 with a lot of help from some of you attending today and many other volunteers. What's relevant here, in my opinion, is to take a moment and remind yourself if there are opportunities to move strategies in this document forward as part of your work, your negotiations, your discussions that you might not have thought of before. Also, a lot of this work is bringing together a lot of people who are interested in improving broadband, and they might be looking to maybe expand the types of work they're doing in their community. Lots of good ideas in this document. And thank you to everyone who's saying hello and introducing themselves via the chat. So those were a couple of general resources to share with you, remind you of. The third one I wanted to bring up that's closest to what we're here today to talk about is something we published in the fall, and that has an emphasis on the Chesterfield model and the work that results in these negotiations even coming up. So I want to turn it over to Todd, who did a lot of the heavy lifting to develop this with your help as well, to just remind people what's in here and introduce it for those of you who weren't aware this is a resource. Thanks, Todd.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. So just briefly, really the purpose of the implementation guide is to synthesize all of the work and experience that has been conducted by local broadband champions in our region. Like pursuing what we're calling the Chesterfield model. It started in Chesterfield as a grassroots effort, and it's expanded to other communities where it's similarly been a grassroots effort. And really all this guide attempts to do is to document all that great work and really trailblazing work on broadband expansion. For folks on the call that are considering finalizing an agreement with an internet service provider, you've already brought the issue to town vote and it's passed. You've already completed a lot of the steps that are listed in this guide. So I think we just wanted to highlight this for folks who might be earlier on in the process. It's a good resource, and we're hoping to update it at some point in the future. It's still relatively current, but there have been some policy related changes and other lessons that have been learned along the way. So, if you have any questions on the content in the guide, I encourage folks to reach out. And, one area where the guide content is a bit more thin is the issue we're talking about today, which is finalizing agreements with the provider. So hopefully we can add that content in the future and use your folks' experience as a source of information on that topic. So I think I'll leave it at that, Henry.
Cool. Thank you, Todd. That was great. So where can you find this? The quickest place to find this is at our broadband planning webpage, swrpc.org/broadband. Go to resources, and it'll be listed at the top. Just to quickly point out as well, this is one place where you can start to network a little in our region, see what other committees are doing, what they have published. There are also some other documents to help you along your way. And I encourage you to check out this kind of extensive page. Okay, switch back to today's agenda. Well, is there like one or two questions on broadband resources before we move on? Any questions so far? Okay, great. So let's move on to the discussion topics. They're on page 2 of your agenda, and I will switch my view so we can take a look at these and move them around. As I said, a number of people wrote to me or called me with questions that were related to the negotiation process, specific parts, of the agreement as I understand it. And what I've done here is list those out 1 through 9. In some cases, I paraphrased, and would like folks to just read this through for a moment. And what I want to know is, do any of these need to be clarified, and are there things missing? Those are the first 2 questions. Do we need to add anything? Do these things make sense? And you can see some of the suggestions might deal with how a term is defined, like in an agreement or a discussion with a provider. When it says town-wide, what exactly does that mean? What about in 5 years when a large subdivision is proposed? How is that addressed? Another one that a number of people have seemed to have brought up are the ability to negotiate drops or providing access to certain town anchor, institutions, we call them, libraries, town offices. How is that being handled? Any questions on what's listed here or suggestions for new items? Yeah, I see one hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted. Tim Wessels, Town of Ringe Teltech Committee. Point number one, town-wide, you want to use every street address in town up to the limits, up to the town's limits, whatever the lines are in the map. You want to be able to cover every known street address. For resident, and item number 2, language defining quality of service up to versus no less than. For residential service agreements, it's always going to be up to. There are no, there's no service level guarantees in our contract with Consolidated, and everything is up to a certain peak value in your service package from Consolidated. Commercial clients, they can go for service level agreements. Presumably they may have more on the line than a resident of the town does.
And Tim, could I ask you to pause for just a minute? At this point, I just want to make sure everyone sees and understands the potential topics, and that there aren't new ones to add. And then after that, what I'd like us to do is, as a group, decide which ones we want to talk about first, so we make sure we get through the discussion you want to have. So I guess save comments for now. Are there any new things to add, or is anything not making sense to anyone that's here? Okay, that's fine. It was really only a couple of members that sent a number of these, but again, the purpose of today is to share ideas about each one, how they might answer that question, handle that in their discussions or the language of their agreement. Maybe to the folks that proposed these or are seeing them now, and they seem really interesting. What would you like to see talked about first today? What do we want to make sure we get to? Tom, go ahead.
I'm Tom Sherpa with Sullivan Broadband Committee. I think we are the outliers in that we're going with Fibercast, or in contract negotiations with Fibercast right now. And as far as I know, just about everybody else is with CCI. So this list of items actually kind of mirrored some of the discussion points that we had already seen in the draft contract from Fibercast. So one of the things that I'm looking for is, what we might have, or what some examples might be for specific language. For us in particular, looking at the discussion about payment and performance bonds is one that came up with our town. Our selectmen said that they did not need to have a payment bond, provided that we can add language that addresses essentially ensuring contractors are paid before the town makes payments to the company. But they are looking to have a performance bond included in there to protect the town during the construction phase. So that's one that I certainly would like to talk about. Another one that we're going to push back on or request is public access at these community anchors. So not just having service there, but also having it available to the public at particular locations. So those are two in particular that I want to make sure that we hit. Other things that I did not see in our contract that I'm interested in would be pricing variability over time and modernization responsibilities. So if there's any suggestions or language considerations, I'd love to hear it. Thank you.
Thanks for the feedback, Tom. Christine, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wondered if, while we're having these conversations, if we can be thinking about, is there anything that we would want to change legislatively. Like I'm thinking, for example, of the defining townwide, because there's been a lot of wiggle room on that in the RFI and RFP process. And it would be great to see a clear definition on that one in particular, rather than at the contract phase, having it a little bit earlier in the process.
Great comment. And Tom, going back to your comment, and the idea of people are going to be interested in suggested language, specific language. If you're hearing, if you know that you've answered that question, send those materials along to me, and I'll set them up in that online resource link for others to look at. I think Lisa, you're next.
We have some folks in our community who are worried that CCI might partner with some outsourced companies that don't provide the same level of service that they promised that they would directly. So for instance, installers have been a bit unprofessional going into homes, and our hope is just to have some service level agreement on what sorts of subcontractors they're going to bring into the homes of our constituents.
Oh, that's a good one, and I don't think it's on the list here. Maybe if I just drop it in the middle. I think this is, I guess, maybe call it subcontracting, and concern about quality of service work. Is that about right, Lisa? Okay. Jan, go ahead. Anything to add?
One of ours was determining ownership of the network following payoff, and it's a big concern. I'm from Roxbury, and it's something that's come up as a kind of a major point for us. So wondering how others have handled that or are thinking about that.
Yeah, I imagine that's a lot of shared question. Any other things to add? Go ahead.
And you have it in there as number 2 also.
Ooh, thank you.
Yep.
Cool. I think Kimberly, you're waiting to go next.
Hi. One thing that our select board was wondering about as they were looking through the service agreement we got was there's no indication of how often that infrastructure recovery fee gets renegotiated.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That could probably fit under this one, item 7. Christine, did you have an additional comment?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Yeah, yes, I did. Just under number 6 on subcontracting, it just reminded me, we did have a question come up around traffic control. I guess there was an incident in a neighboring town related to traffic control when they were working. So we asked, we've accepted the proposal from CCI, but we have not entered into a contract yet, but that was one thing we talked about. And I think it falls under the subcontracting header, but specific to traffic control.
Right, these are, many months of work, and there's real impacts there. So is there anyone else who wants to add anything to the list or amend the list a little bit? Tom, are you waiting, or did I not put your hand back down?
Actually, I did want to follow up on that question about renegotiating the infrastructure payment. this is something when we've looked at the Chesterfield contract, as well as I believe it was Westmoreland's and Harrisville's, we noticed that there were differences. And one of the things that could come up is if the Senate passes the broadband grant program, the matching grant program, we need to be careful and make sure that perhaps we want to make sure that the towns can get that grant money and not end up boxing themselves in a way that they don't benefit from it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's almost a separate thing. There's consumer pricing, but then there's the town payments. And, who can pay those, and when do they change? Okay. Still a couple hands coming up, which is great. I think. And Senator, correct me, please. Apologize for the pronunciation. Is it Ricciardi?
It's Ricciardi, but
Ricciardi.
you can call me
Thank
Denise.
you for joining today.
Yes, and I do apologize. I have another meeting and I can't stay for the full presentation, but with the gentleman's last message, please use me as a resource and reach out for any help with that grant money. I hope that passes, but I will be a good tool for you to help guide you through the process.
Thanks for that invitation. Kimberly, are you waiting to speak, or did you not put your hand down?
I think I didn't put my hand down.
Okay, just checking. Tom from Greenfield, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the issues that we noticed recently is that the acceptance period is very short. There's a five days to accept the network, and that just seems like a very, very high pressure sort of a thing. We'd like to see that longer, particularly if we're going to actually review it rather than just rubber stamp it.
Did you say that was the term for reviewing the draft agreement?
No, for accepting the network as built out.
Okay.
Yeah. So when they come to you and say, "Hey, we're done," you got 5 days to either agree or disagree.
All right. I think that's
Should be. I haven't looked at or haven't read the entire one from Ringe that you've got posted here, but I would imagine they have the same term in there.
Okay. Yeah, let us know if looking at it you see a difference. Okay. Well, good news and bad news. These are some really important things to add, but we've made our list a lot longer. We want to, again, got to decide, like, are we just going to spend a couple of minutes on each one, share some initial thoughts, or are we just going to go into this knowing we won't get to the lower priority ones? Does anyone object to going forward with the idea we try to spend a little bit on each? So I've reserved this meeting space until a little after 2. I'm happy to be here that whole time. Any comments? Okay. Let's go ahead, Jan.
Yeah, Henry. I just wondered whether we could have a second session. I mean, if rather than shortening the conversation, these are good topics, and I'd really like to see us address all of them.
Yeah. I think looking at this now, I feel like we need one unless people are really quiet. And we're happy to do that. We probably want to arrange to do it pretty soon too.
Yeah.
So let's just start at the top and cross that bridge when we get there. We're available to reschedule a second meeting, and we can find out when people are free. If for some reason you have to drop out, let me know in the chat when would be a good time for you. All right. Well, again, I'm just going to try to not speak as much now. My job is just to keep us a little organized, and let's just move through the discussion topics numerically. It would be helpful if people who were most interested in the topic, you proposed it, you just shared something about it, if you could elaborate a little bit and say maybe where specifically your town or you want some feedback or help. So the first one, how town-wide is defined. No, it wasn't Tom. Excuse me, Tim. Tim shared some feedback on there that town-wide should mean all existing addresses. I know one question I got in the email was, how are people talking about future development? Could anyone speak to that?
Henry, this is Christine. So in our town, I think this has come up at other broadband meetings, but we resubmitted our RFP or put it out there again because this was really fuzzy for us, this definition, and we did not get clear information from Comcast. And how we ended up redoing our RFP was based on road mileage rather than on addresses. And we did take out, places that we knew were obvious. There was not going to be development like, Monadnock and Temple Mountain, areas that are permanently in conservation. But we looked at road mileage as for our definition of townwide, because we do have a lot of undeveloped land that is not in conservation. And we have some properties, some residences that are on the other side of large chunks of these land, and those residents would have been left out otherwise if we did not include that road mileage. So that's how we did it, so that we could reach every resident. There was no other way for us to do it, to get every resident covered than for providers to go on those undeveloped areas of town.
And Christine, a quick follow-up question. I think you were referring to that definition being in the town's request for proposals. Am I understanding that right? And is it the case that that would then be kind of applied to an agreement later in the process? Use the same definition?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we know, we're not under contract with Consolidated yet. We vote in June. But we have asked this question at every one of our meetings, and their response is always, everyone's going to be covered. And we gave them a map and we gave them the road mileage. And, I don't want to pick on Comcast, but they left out a large percentage of residents because there are of undeveloped land on some of our roads. So that's how we got to that, and we will put it in our contract, because we have these outliers in town, to make sure that they are covered when they do their build out. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. I think Kim is next. Kimberly.
In my conversations with Rob Custer, he has always referred to all existing addresses as well as future building. I don't know if that's helpful, but I know.
Yeah, that I think you're talking about just like a one-on-one conversation or a group meeting, not a document. Um, the future part of that really is key, I think. I'll invite Carol Monroe to go next. And really, guys, feel free to just unmute yourselves and kind of speak at will. We're not too big a group.
So on this topic, a couple of things. One is to insist on universal access, and where there are outliers in town, particularly those areas that are maybe fed from a wire center from an adjoining town, to make sure that that's clearly spelled out. So it's not just those served from the Dublin CO, it's those served anywhere in Dublin, and that's true. So we have some served from Jaffrey, some served from Peterborough, some served from Marlborough, and it will all be covered. And we made sure that those were directly spelled out in both the RFP and in the agreement following. So that was there. Future is should be addressed. And I've heard Rob say that as well. In the same way as you would today, if you were to build a house, you would arrange with the utilities and make sure you have conduit for your electrical service and your phone service. And in this case, it would be fiber. My guess is that's what they'll be providing for new builds going forward in Dublin is a fiber type access. So that hasn't been an issue here. Lots of people in town have asked questions as to whether they're covered or not, particularly if they don't see on the map that they're that the map extends to their home. Often you'll find that what's being mapped when you see it coming from Consolidated is the main line of fiber, not the drop construction. So if you're at the end of a road and there are 3 houses on a dirt road with a dead end, it might stop, a quarter of a mile from those houses with the idea they'll be running drop fiber from that last access point to all 3 of those houses, but it doesn't show directly on the map, and that made people nervous. But I think that's proceeding. And so I think it really, to be clear about universal access is important. Keeping in mind that those that are off grid, the onus is on them to provide a clear path, just like a new house. So if you're off grid and you've chosen to be off grid and there are no poles and no underground to that premise, it doesn't mean they can't have it, but they have to provide a clear path to the nearest utility pole. So that's the other place that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. That's it.
Thanks, Carolyn. Appreciate you joining as someone who's been through this. Went through this
I can only
year.
be here. I can only be here till 1 o'clock. I have a select board obligation at 1. Thanks.
So I think Tom is next. Do you have something to add? And then Doug.
I muted instead of unmuting. 2 things really. I'm a little confused about how using road mileage works. Is that really road frontage? Are you saying everybody on a main road and up to a class 5 or something is included? If you just say we have 51 miles of roads, how does that ensure access? And the other is really for Carol. I think I heard you say that you had specific language for universal access that you used in Dublin. Is that something you can share?
No, we called it universal access, but we spelled out every premise in town.
Yeah.
And then where we thought it might be questionable, those on the fringe, we made sure we spelled that out directly. And that has not been an issue for us. We also don't have any Comcast. I fully expect any Comcast or Charter response will not be universal. That's not in their DNA to do that. It wouldn't surprise me that it's not because they don't understand. Don't let them fool you. They do. They understand what universal access is. They just don't
Well,
want to provide it.
Yeah, but so was there a specific, I mean, you had some verbiage in your contract with CCI that defines what you mean by universal access?
I think that's what it says, is universal access. I don't think it defines it specifically, but we've not had any issue with that. Access to every premise in Dublin.
Yeah, and the Harrisville one, we haven't had any issue either, but we put in the contract, all town residences and businesses.
Thanks for the questions, Tom. Maybe a minute for anyone from Temple to respond about the question on defining road mileage. Like, was that broken down by classification or anything like that? Christine, if you heard that question, that would help out Tom.
Yes, sure. Yes, it was broken down by classification, state road versus town road versus private road. We broke those out as well. And we drove through our town and we mapped it out. If there was a house, we included the whole road, if the house at the end. And we looked at the poles, we looked where there was access. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but we included every mile of road in town, and we did identify what type of road it was and whether or not there was existing infrastructure.
Doug, go ahead. You've been waiting.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I had to join a bit late and I won't be able to stay on for the whole time, but I think it's important to spell out the concept of universal access as the network is being built out. I think one of the advantages, I'm on the Troy Broadband Committee. I think one of the advantages relative to Troy is the fact that there are neighboring towns that are also using CCI. So even though it might be easier to provide access to a resident on the fringe of the town area from another town, I think that that's perfectly fine. The issue is not, whether their service comes out of Troy or comes out of, Jaffrey or Fitzwilliam, but, do they have access to that service? In my conversation with Ron Kester relative to private roads, because I think that's probably where one of the issues could become problematic down the road, no pun intended, is the fact that you have a plot of land that's presently not developed and does get developed privately, is accessed by a private road. It was very clear in our discussions with Rob and in the explanations that we made to the public, both in our public benefit hearing as well as other devices that we communicated by means, that in the case of a private road, if there was already existing conduit or poles, then that could be used. But if they're at no cost to the consumer, but if there wasn't, then the cost of bringing that service to that residence or building or business would have to be borne by the consumer rather than by Consolidated, or some kind of negotiation between the two for a satisfactory solution for that. So that's my understanding of how the private road issue might be handled. I think it is important that, and maybe this is the easiest way to get to a solution here, is to say that, service is expected to run along the road frontage, every place except where there's conservation easements or some kind of restriction on the use of that land that would bar any kind of future development at that point. And that way they don't have to end up running wire or running, fiber someplace where it will never be used, which I'm sure, they would object to, and it's not necessary for us to require it.
Good points. Good points, Doug. Lisa, I'll give you the last comment on this one.
All right, I just want to caution against saying residences and businesses, because there are other things. If you think about it, your recreation center is neither. If there's a cabin that's not always occupied, it's arguable. Is it a residence? Is it not? your town common, maybe it already gets internet access and people go there to browse their phones and things. So I think that it may be prudent to say all currently served areas or presently served areas have to be included. Not that they would cut them out, but
Thanks, Lisa. That's a
guarantee
good
that
point.
these, which are not either.
Yeah, residents and businesses is too restrictive, I think, a classification, because you've got nonprofits, you've got public property, you know, a variety of other legitimate uses.
All right. Lot of points to think about on that topic. And again, the call's out there. If people have specific language or examples they want to share, email them to me. I'll get them posted so we can all access them. Let's move on to the question about who owns what after the 20-year or whatever term bond is paid off. My impression is people haven't decided this yet, but I guess if someone who proposed this or is really interested could explain this a little bit more to get this conversation started.
I'll start. Well, in the case of Troy, we have areas that are served and areas that are unserved. And our bond is providing the ability to build a network out to those areas that are unserved. So that network is being built out with bond money rather than with CCI money. So at the end of the bond, it has to be determined who is not only going to own that, but even perhaps more importantly, who's going to maintain that. So I think that, you know, each town probably ought to decide for itself what is appropriate for their situation. You know, in the case of ownership being transferred perhaps to a private company, I don't know what kind of legal impediments there are to that, but it does perhaps solve the problem relative to maintenance, that if you own it, you're going to have to maintain it. But if it does have to be retained, ownership does have to be retained for the part that was built out via bond funding, then you do need to have some kind of agreement in place relative to who's going to maintain that in an effective way over time.
So a couple people with their hands up. Lisa, did you have a thought on this or is that an old one? Okay, so Jan, did you have a comment on this second topic?
Yeah, I was just wondering, for those people who've been through the process, have they addressed this in the contract? Because we're actually thinking the way technology changes, that this network may just be obsolete by the end of the bond payoff period, and nobody wants it. And so we might be happy to be able to say in the contract, if allowed, that yeah, we'll sell the network to Consolidated for $1 after 20 years because, you know, we don't really want it by then. We're guessing, but just wondering what other people have done.
Maybe Tim he had his hand up next. Go ahead.
Yeah, the useful life of a fiber network is 20 to 40 years. Conditions depend, you know, it's condition dependent, but I wouldn't worry about it becoming obsolete or useless at some point in time. You have to own what you bond for. That's the law. So even Chesterfield, which in their agreement turns over their bonded town-funded network to Consolidated immediately after the bond is repaid. That language is absent in the 5 towns that came after Chesterfield. So Walpole, Westmoreland, Dublin, Harrisville, and Rindge do not have that language in their contracts. So the town will actually have an asset that it continues to own after the bond is repaid in 20 years. The maintenance of the town-funded network is covered by Consolidated through their master services agreement with the town. All 5 of the towns that are building right now are built and now connecting customers. They've all executed 20-year master services agreement, which coincides with the term of the bond. And it's Consolidated's job to maintain that network, whether the town, you know, the town-owned, town-funded pieces of it and the parts that Consolidated owns. So I don't see any issue there. At the end of 20 years, the towns can choose to renew their services agreement with Consolidated on a year-by-year basis, or create an RFP and send out proposals for a new service provider.
Thanks, Tim. That's really helpful to know about that change between the first, pilot agreement and the most recent ones. Tom, did you have a comment on this?
Yeah, from Sullivan's perspective, we were looking very closely at the ownership of the different pieces here. And it's part of it is, who owns it after the project is done. But the more pressing concern was if there was a default, during the 20-year lifespan, who would what? And basically, as far as I'm reading what's been proposed so far is the town basically owns the fiber, but then the provider would own the head end. And we're looking at, they're like actually buying a lot and building a head end building to serve it, and that they would retain ownership of that even in a default. And basically the town would only get the town funded assets, which would be the fiber network. And so basically that would allow the town to bring somebody else in to maintain it at that point. So that's something that, I'm interested in terms of, those dividing lines, what's town owned, what's not town owned, what would it take to get another provider in to be able to operate the system if the company defaulted on their agreement.
There is language in the town of Ringe agreement, and I'm sure in the other 4 towns, that covers any default by Consolidated and what the remedies are for a default by Consolidated.
I think too that Tom Bascom's remark in the chat is important to note and to account for in the contract. What if CCI gets purchased by somebody else down the road? We need to make sure that the contracts that we have with CCI survive any merger or acquisition that may happen down the road over the course of the bond and even subsequent.
Understanding about the language of town ownership at the end of the bond payment period is that got changed after Chesterfield, mostly to allow towns to get bonds in a different group, the taxable versus non-taxable issue, and the amounts that were available, with more and more towns trying to enter bond sales at the same time.
I didn't know that. Thanks, Kimberly.
Is there one type of language or one type of an agreement that's better than the other for that, just to get the flexibility for bond purchases?
I believe, I can never remember which is which, taxable, non-taxable, but I bet Carol Monroe does. But my understanding is that for one of them, which is the larger pool available, which I think is taxable, I can't remember that part, but you do need to own the network at the end. And I think that's the reason that language changed after Chesterfield. Maybe Carol has info about that.
Cool. Well, I'll leave it here in case you want to come back to it.
Well, do you want me to comment on that?
Yeah, please go ahead, Carol.
So yes, they changed it so that it would be considered to be non-taxable, and they did a number of things that would do that. But in the end, the bond bank decided to bundle them all together as a taxable bond. So that was the reasoning behind it, is so it would be, the bond could be non-taxable, but the bond bank decided they were going to make them all taxable bonds anyway, because they had enough for to create a one issue of taxable bonds.
That's really helpful. I learned something new. I assume they won't have a problem getting enough of a big group together this round. I think the discussion, the third discussion question that I bumped up is kind of tied to this. I think it has to do with, well, what exactly does the town own, through their bond? Is it the drops? Is it, the fiber that just passes by the roads? That's kind of what's at issue at ownership following the bond payoff. And if I'm remembering right, I think the person who suggested this felt there wasn't enough detail in the agreement as to what the town owns. Are others having
The
this
agreement,
Yeah.
the agreement says that Consolidated will keep accurate books. So I think that's supposed to be our protection from that, but there's no real mention of a specific inventory of what it is we own. And as they make changes to it, which you would assume there will be some changes as they maintain things, as they fix downed lines or defective components in the central office or whatever. What are they changing? What are they doing? Or as they upgrade things? I mean, kind of lower down here, we're going to talk about maintenance and modernization responsibilities, but there's going to be change over time, and we don't have a whole lot of insight into that.
Maybe it'd be helpful here to mention like how people understand what their town-owned network is to begin with. What components are part of this? Go ahead, Carol.
So it's my understanding, it gets very complicated because in some cases you own it, but it'll be hard to separate it from CCI. So it's my understanding that the towns own the fiber on the poles, all of the fiber, and throughout all of the town, even though they're really only paid for, in the case of Dublin, 83% of it. So even though they only 83% were unserved, just to give you an idea what that means. So even though it was only 83%, you own all the fiber on the poles, that distribution fiber. So they already had fiber feeding their DSL slams, DSL boxes. So I don't mean that fiber, but all the distribution fiber, all the splitter cabinets in the field. And so those, it's different than the way that we construct in other areas, but they do this is a GPON network, and their splitters are in cabinets. They look a lot like DSL cabinets in the field. In Dublin, there were 4 of them. And all OLTs, which is optical line terminators in the equipment in their CO. And that's it. And so from the OLT, that Consolidated owns the drop from the street to the house and the equipment in the house. And they've made that quite clear. But if there were a termination issue, they would be willing to negotiate that drop with whomever would take over the network. But that is that is their owner. They do own that. And they pay for that, by the way. That's not included in our general obligation bond funds to do that drop. Consolidated is doing that drop. And then they own all the backhaul and all the routing and switching equipment in the local central office that will take it to the next level, to wherever the backhaul is going to go to. So that sort of is a sort of a concise definition of what we think that we own. And then, but what makes that very, very complicated is in order for them to do this at the price that they're offering, which is generally a price that doesn't, there's no room for make-ready work in that price, or very little make-ready work for that price on the poles, they're overlashing to the existing copper. And that's what I meant about a complication. Okay, I own the fiber on the poles, but it's overlashed to somebody else's copper. And that will become interesting in 20 years about when it comes to ownership, or in the case of a default on somebody's part. That's the piece that's always made me a little uneasy, but it is also the piece that makes it $1 million, more than $1 million less expensive than some other partner. So that's, I think that's all I can add to that.
That's really helpful, Carol. Did I hear you right when I thought I heard you say that there's language that says after the town takes ownership, they would be able to transfer the town-owned assets to another company or allow them to be used by another company?
Only on the term, only within the termination pieces of the contract. So it's a 20-year
okay.
contract. So only if something were to default in that 20-year contract could you do that. But yes, so the real question is there any value in the copper in 20 years if there's nobody using it and it's only being used as strand, meaning holding up the fiber, or whether there's still use in the copper that's that a company buying CCI or merging or acquiring or taking out of bankruptcy might want a monetary sum for. That we don't know.
So I just want to jump in and say that the town of Troy is only 27% unserved. So I'm wondering how this would work for us, because really most of the network is they're doing without the help of the bond. Our bond is really small, $233,000. Somewhere, is it 244? Somewhere around there. So I do feel like in Troy, at least, that's going to take a bigger conversation about who actually owns it after. Carol, if I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong.
No, you're not wrong. I don't think any of the 6 towns was quite that low. I was hoping one of them would step in. Ringe was still a higher percentage, I think, than that. And I know that Walpole had partly Charter or Comcast in there, but probably not quite that low as 23%. But so I would imagine that would even show up in the earlier pieces of the contract that talk about ownership, because I'm not sure that they'll let you own 100% of the fiber if they needed only to build fiber to 23% of the town. So I think that is a negotiating point that will be interesting for all of us to learn about, because there'll be others like it.
Thank you.
All right, good discussion on this list. Any other comments on, an inventory of sorts that would be in the agreement? Let's just keep going. We can come back to these as well. The next item is about language in the agreement or contract that talks about quality of service. And I think people are mainly thinking about speeds. 1 gigabit, what are the speed tiers, and what's an acceptable, I guess, standard for how close a customer will get to those advertised speeds. Doug, did you want to jump in on this one?
Yes, I am not a fan of up to language, because as that normally works out, you end up with the lowest common denominator in terms of what you get for service. Whether we want to specify no less than, I think that's worth considering. I know that in our conversation with our residents in Troy, a big reason why people were enthusiastic about the project was that they knew they were going to get better performance. And I think that the up to is too easy to makes it too easy for a provider to say, well, on a good day, if everybody's on vacation and there's only one person in town online, and they're going to get up to the 50 megabits or 100 megabit, whatever it is. But in the normal everyday life, up to can be pretty miserable. So I'm not a fan of up to language. I think no less than probably makes more sense in delivering what was promised.
Tom, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I think that, well, I certainly agree from the DSL perspective that I'm struggling with now. I think there might be a fundamental difference in terms of fiber's performance. I'd like to hear input from others that do have fiber available where they are, or maybe the experiences of what, service levels or how close they get to the advertised speed you actually get with the fiber service. My understanding is that it's less prone to those, traffic congestion issues or weather related things than current DSL technology.
Good question.
That's a good point. Maybe we need both. Maybe we need to combine, up to, but no less than.
No, up to is just weasel language from marketing guys. In our last phone call with CCI, this came up, and one of their guys, the construction guy or the pricing guy, said that their current plan is to over provision the lines slightly so that people always get what they're paying for. And I think we should put that in the contract. Because what'll happen, as my comment in the chat says, 5 years from now, it's not going to be consolidated. 5 years ago, it wasn't consolidated. And 5 years before that, it wasn't Fairpoint. It's going to be somebody else. And if it's somebody like Comcast, just to pick an example, then they're going to interpret this contract in the worst possible way. And we need the contracts to hold them accountable for what they're promising. And what they're promising is fiber performance. They're promising gigabit networks. Up to is not the right language. No less than is the right language. I feel very strongly about it, in case you can't tell.
That's a good thing. That's what we feel. That's why we're here talking about broadband on our lunch hour. I guess does anyone know if this is like a non-starter, or has anyone tried this to say no less than versus up to?
I think no less than is consistent with what our conversation with the CCI has been in terms of what they say they are able to deliver. If they say they're able to deliver, let's carve it in stone.
Yep.
Usually the person doing the carving in stone is less amenable to making those changes than the salesperson, though. That's my concern. I think that was Henry's point.
Well, they're talking about how they're going to roll this out, and in year one, they're already talking about 2 gigabits as what they want to offer. So, having something that says it's not going to be any less than 1 gigabit is not particularly onerous for them. There shouldn't be, unless they're completely making this stuff up, which I don't think they are.
I think where we're going with this topic is related to the item 5, actually, because like you're saying, where we're originally talking about 1 gigabit as a target, the maximum. Already, it could be 2 gigabits, next year, and maybe over the course of 5 or 10 years that goes up again. How does that change, relate to whether they can keep providing or over provisioning, and delivering on the new technology? Because it's, no one wants to hold the, I assume no one wants to hold the provider to 1 gigabit for 20 years. How's that modernization aspect addressed, or do you talk about speed improvements?
Well, there is an upper limit of capacity for speed on the GPON network. So I think that that's an issue that needs to be clearly outlined, that, once that limit is hit, what responsibility, if any, if there's need for further speed, is to be borne by the provider.
So I'm skimming through the list, and I think the only person who's really been through these in detail, who's still with us, is Tim. And I invite you not to be shy, Tim, if this modernization thing was mentioned in the Ringe contract. This might be one that we want to put in the parking lot and revisit.
I have a question that ties closely with this.
Please.
And that is, what sort of service are they going to, I'm sorry, it was actually number 4. Well, okay, so it is 5 in a way. So are they going to maintain the existing service, the copper lines, the home phone service? Because as we move farther away from that, people who want to maintain their home phone line, their dial-up line, are scared that it's going to go away because those copper lines are going to rot. They're never going to be fixed.
In conversations that I've had with the CCI guys about that, they've kind of said yes, but they've qualified a lot when that comes up. What they would rather do is offer people a really good deal to sign on to fiber if at some point their DSL is unusable.
They're going to kill the DSL as quickly as they can.
We have folks who are up on the hill in Troy and they don't get cell phone service up there. They really want to keep their home phone, but they don't want VoIP.
Doug, did you have a comment on this topic? No.
Yeah, I think that that's probably a topic that needs that really expands beyond the scope of just what technology services are needed by towns, because you get into the whole 911 emergency services issue. You do have people that are uncomfortable with losing their copper network that they rely on for phone service. But there are at least 2 other avenues for phone service that need to be explored. I think that conversation not only with CCI is needed about these sorts of things or any provider, but also with the wireless companies that operate in our region. I think that they have some responsibility there as well to not do what ISPs have done and that just cherry pick the areas where there's the most opportunity for profitability. I don't think that wireless networks ought to be given the same opportunity to cherry pick for something as essential as 911 services. So it's almost a bigger issue than I think can just be addressed in a contract like this, although it's an important issue. I don't want to minimize that at all, but I think a wider discussion on that's probably necessary. Especially since, law enforcement uses these pop-up cell tower networks. I mean, that's another solution that could possibly be used for something of a technology of that sort, much less than a full-blown cell tower that with all of the associated costs, but one of these pop-up cell phone networks that law enforcement frequently uses, at least they do in New Jersey, could be a solution to be helpful to people who are going to lose at some point a copper line for phone service.
Cool. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, my understanding of this, because we did ask this question of Fibercast, and my understanding is that even with a VoIP service, that the IP address that's associated with your terminal in your house is fixed and associated with an address. So it does still tie into the 911 service as connected to a designated address. So that shouldn't be an issue if people switch to a VoIP versus copper. that doesn't address the question of, okay, well, is CCI going to come by and say, yeah, we're not maintaining copper anymore. So now, even though you didn't want fiber, you're going to have to get fiber anyways. That's maybe a different story for people. But the 911 issue shouldn't be an issue because even a VoIP phone does count as a landline.
I know there's a technology question aspect to this too, because the telephone providers are regulated in a different way than internet service providers are. So, we may not be talking about someone having to buy a more expensive phone line. Does anyone know if there's no price difference, for example, or has anyone asked that?
Even if there's no price difference, there is still the difference that on an analog line, you can pick it up when the power's out. If you live way up on West Hill where the wind is heavy and you're worried about the power going out, it makes sense to me why you would be protective of your home phone.
And that can be addressed with some kind of battery backup system, at least for a period of time. So those are concerns. Maybe it's just a matter of providing some education to people who are in that situation. Here are the options that are available to you at whatever point in time you no longer have a copper line for your phone service. And relieve some of the concerns there, but make sure that they are actually well served by whatever replaces it.
All right, these are good comments. I think they're helpful things to think about. Probably need some more discussion. I did want to do like a time check and ask folks how this is going so far. Are we going like at a good pace? Do you want to like pause because we're running out of time? Some feedback would be really helpful at this point.
I'm good.
Well, I'm in favor. We just keep on going. Again, I'm free until we have this reserved till 2. And we'll plan to check in after a couple more questions, and we'll figure out what needs to come up next time and when's a good time to reschedule. All right, so the next one on the list was subcontracting. And yeah, I mean, I've heard there could be equipment limitations this construction season. And their Consolidated, for example, is ramping up so much more. Maybe they can't do it all with their workforce. They're going to have to subcontract. What are people thinking about adding or bringing up in their agreements or contracts?
Well, I've heard some anecdotal conversation regarding, third parties that were used elsewhere not providing the kind of quality. They may need to do some subcontracting, but perhaps we could put in the contract that if that's the case, that at least one consolidated representative needs to be supervising that, on site for work location. They might not have to put out the full crew, but at least have one consolidated guy to give a thumbs up or thumbs down on what's happening.
I think putting some sort of provision around criminal background checks as well.
Good point.
Isn't this all pretty standard contracting stuff that would, any contract where you might have subcontractors working, there's going to be some pretty routine boilerplate for the quality of those subcontractors and the standards they need to be held to.
I think you're right. And I think that they have to check for insurance of their subcontractors and things like that. But I wouldn't want to just assume. I think you're right.
No. It should definitely be there, but I would think that all of our towns have our town attorneys looking at them, and they just need to be poked to say, hey, put the standard subcontractor provisions in there.
So the things that we've heard specifically are that the subcontractors come in and they're using hair dryers and splicing wires, and they're leaving a mess, and it seems like they're unprepared for the job. They don't know what they're doing. Maybe they're using foul language while they're in the house. Just lack of professionalism from the subcontractors.
Okay. So you're particularly concerned about home visits, not necessarily
home-
the guys
home
stringing stuff up on
yes. The installation
road.
visits specifically, yes.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
There is language in the service agreement that somewhat covers training, background skills for any independent contractors or agents assigned to perform services. And if that is happening in some towns where services being connected, I would think that needs to go to the town, and the town needs to go to CCI because they wouldn't be covering their contract.
Thank you for saying that. We haven't seen a copy of a contract of our own yet. So if it's in there, that makes me happy.
Kimberly, if you have access to where that is or the name of the section, that'd be helpful.
Sure. I believe I'm looking at a RING. Let me
Okay.
see. I'm having trouble telling what town. Oh, yes, it's RING service agreement, and it's number 15, consolidated warranty correction of work. I'm not totally familiar with the service agreement yet, but I've been skimming it while I listened and saw information about independent contractors or agents.
Yeah.
Great. And again, RING was in last year's town meeting. So we know.
Yes. The Fitzwilliam service agreement that we just received is very much like RING. There are very few differences at all.
Anything else to bring up or discuss under subcontracting? I know traffic control came up earlier. In some cases, providers ask municipalities to contribute to that. So there might be some differences among towns.
Henry, this is Christine. We don't have the staff for that, so that we wouldn't be one of those towns. I think what came up earlier when we were talking about this, about consolidated supervision and inspection, I would love to see the word on-site be there. I think that would cover in terms of traffic, and also just having a mechanism to report issues. Yeah, as I said, there was a specific traffic incident. And it goes back to that professionalism issue. But just having somebody on site or a mechanism, direct way to report an incident.
Great. How about we keep on going?
Can I say one more thing about the traffic control? There are going to be towns that require that CCI hire the cops for traffic control because they like to get the extra hours. It's a little source of revenue for the town, and they have the CCI will have to pay the hourly rate of the force that is established by the town. So I don't know if that's written into the contract. Why I would imagine that it is. For some towns, it will be, right?
Thanks for adding that, Lisa. So the next topic on the list is kind of switching gears. This is on the consumer side, the pricing that's set up. And I think we're not talking like the bond pricing here. This is, what the subscriber fee outside of that. that's, based on the speed tier. My general understanding is there's kind of a statewide price schedule. So a lot of consolidated pricing is pretty similar. But what are people concerned about or considering relative to pricing in their agreements?
Well, one concern is that there's no mention of it anywhere in the agreements. So they can basically do whatever they want. And they're not regulated as far as the internet services are concerned. So the Public Utilities Commission has no stamp of approval or anything like that.
Okay, so that's where things are starting. Tom, what's your comment?
Yeah, I'm looking at the draft contract that we have, which I believe was actually an optical character recognition scan of Harrisville's contract that was then modified because it has all those OCR errors in it. But it does have information in there about, it says maintain monthly broadband service fees for locations in the town in line with those for similarly situated customers in other portions of New Hampshire. So I think that's the language that I've seen in this contract proposal, as well as I think what was in CCI's, that tries to make sure that it's in line with what's the rest of the state. I've heard their requests for maybe like, most preferred partner or customer type pricing arrangements, but this seems to be, I think, boilerplate for we're not going to gouge any particular town, but I'd be interested to hear if there's others that have improvements to this language that could be proposed.
Which part of the contract is that?
In mine was, where was this one? This was under the, was it really? Under the ownership of the work, product and proprietary rights. That was one place that it showed up. The other place that it showed up was, where was it? No, it's in here twice. The other place was, yeah, can't find it. Pretty sure it was in here at least a couple of times though.
Okay, it sounds like it's pretty vague and no one's, proposed or thought about putting limits or objective information to those statements so far.
Yeah, I'm looking at that section. I don't see anything.
Yeah, it may be that we have to live with some kind of language that, makes it competitive pricing with what is found for similar service elsewhere, sort of language. But yeah, I think it relates to the, issue that we talked about regarding telephone lines that are copper disappearing. I think that, again, this is something that probably is, because it has become such an essential virtual utility for people, it's a larger public policy issue in terms of whether or not this sort of thing needs some sort of regulation.
By the way, I found the other place that it shows up. It showed up in the subscriber connection section of this particular contract under attachment B, network operation.
Attachment B.
Yeah.
Thanks for digging up the reference. Maybe like a question related to this. This is a novice question, but do the agreements specify what the monthly costs are by speed tier? And do they specify things like the pricing for things like, having a Wi-Fi router, the monthly costs, the one-time costs? Are those documented?
No.
Okay.
I can speak from Sullivan. Those were documented in our in the proposal, but not in the contract.
Okay. That's helpful to know. Do people want to talk more on this one?
Just one clarification that I just remembered, that the proposal was included as an attachment to the contract, so it does
Okay.
get connected in.
Okay, that's helpful.
And does it say in the contract how long that introductory pricing will last?
That's not in the contract, Lisa. It's in their proposal. And in Fitzwilliam's case, their promised rates are good for a year. They call them an introductory rate. And what else did I want to tell you about that? It's already significantly less than what they gave us in our proposal this summer. So it changes. I'm pretty sure Rob's response to this question would be competition will keep them in line. You know, that's what they like to say. And he also said very recently in a public meeting in Fitzwilliam that they go up. He's expecting like each tier to go up about $10 at the end per month at the end of the 1 year. But he said that they often negotiate special deals when people renew. So he was pretty vague, but.
Just, did they say anything about package pricing as well? So if people have the home phone line and they choose to keep it, does the package pricing continue on?
I do not believe so. I have not heard him say that it would. He did say to figure out what VoIP would cost you, the voice over internet, add your current DSL phone cost to the internet fiber cost. That's all I've really heard him say about that.
Thanks, Kimberly. Did I capture your comment correctly that Consolidated's pricing dropped between when they responded to the RFP and today?
Yes, it dropped and they changed their pricing. I believe their lowest, I'd have to look to be sure, was 25 megabits and now it's 50. So It changed dramatically and for the better, honestly.
Yeah, they increased their speeds and decreased their prices. It was pretty dramatic.
Yeah,
All of which is, that's all great, but once again, the nightmare scenario of Comcast buying them out in a couple of years, it's like, what's going to happen then? What are our protections?
Free market. Yeah, I mean, we had the same concerns because that updated pricing from CCI came by after we had decided on Fibercast. And so we brought that up with them and they said, this is where that language about maintaining comparable prices throughout the state comes in. If they want to stay competitive, they're going to have to, remain competitive in terms of pricing. I hope.
Well, until they kill off all their competitors and then they can charge whatever they want. I hate to be a cynic, but that's how it works.
I'd be interested if there's some way to get pricing protection into the contract, like a rate of increase or something like that. I'm not sure how amenable they would be to making all those types of specific agreements on a town by town basis, though.
Well, that's the advantage of having a dozen towns.
Yeah, I think we ought to become a negotiating group.
Yep.
They're now stating that they intend for their pricing to be the same across the state, and it wasn't before. This is pretty recent development.
It's not right now. If you go from town to town, pretending that your zip code is various places, you'll get quite different pricing. Over on the seacoast, they have some very attractive prices. In Milford, not so attractive. Greenfield, definitely not attractive. So,
Have you looked in the past month?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks for sharing the observations, everyone. So item 8 on this list is kind of tied into this pricing question. And it came up in a couple ways. You know, for one, I think communities want internet for everyone, every address in town. And I think to some extent they're thinking of, okay, well, we have a range of income levels in our community. Internet costs can be a burden. And the other aspect is, in the case of, for example, some cable providers like Comcast, they've worked, I believe, through an FCC program to offer reduced cost, internet packages to help meet that need. Are people thinking of like this affordability question, and have you heard of programs like that? Any comments on this one?
Wasn't there something in the stimulus bill back in December that Congress passed relative to the coronavirus situation that was going to provide, $7 billion of money for low income rebate for internet access or something? Is that a viable program, and how will this
Yes.
impact what we're doing?
It is still in development. I just got an email from the state this morning saying that the FCC will be tasked with developing what that process looks like, but they've only got like 30 or 60 days to do it. So it should be getting to us pretty quick.
The key though, Neil, if I'm remembering right, correct me if I'm wrong, is that this is like a monthly contribution to someone's retail bill, and it's not it's not an ongoing program. There's some sunset to it.
They haven't defined it yet in Biden's just passed stimulus. So there's a lot of questions around that. What's a sunset? What's the get into qualifiers? None of it's defined.
Okay, so something to watch. Any other questions or ideas related to affordability?
Just that I'm not sure what it is that Keene Housing is doing, but it seems like it's working. Haven't had time to research it. I know that they're supplementing the payments for a lot of the Keene Housing recipients.
In our responses from providers, the other two that weren't CCI did have a low income tier that started at the FCC definition of broadband, and it looked good, and I was concerned that CCIs did not have that, but at this point their 50 megabits is less than either of those companies were offering 25 for. So I kind of let that idea slide for now.
But the key, of course, is, in a year that household is going to be faced with $20, $25 more. Does that make a difference? I assume the other two providers wouldn't increase after a year.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that part of it. That's been a concern for me, but I believe it would be a $10 increase after a year. But I'd have to check that to be positive.
Jan, go ahead.
Yeah, our concern was, there are some other federal programs, but we are concerned about sunsetting, and we actually are hoping that Consolidated will do something rather than relying on a federal or even a state program. That Consolidated should have something of their own that addresses this issue.
They did mention that they participate in the federal Lifeline program. I looked at that. It's fairly minimal in terms of what support it offers, but it does offer some pricing support for people who are low income.
And Tom, do you happen to know if that was for phone and internet or just for phone?
I think it was, as I recall, this was a couple of months ago, but as I recall, it was one or the other.
Hmm.
You couldn't have both, but you could pick one.
Hmm.
That's what I remember. Don't take my word for it.
I wonder, I don't know how this would work, but a lot of the help that comes to families on a fixed income or a lower income, it comes from grants. So maybe we could ask that CCI be cooperative with those grant writers and make it easier for them to submit the information that's required for the grants.
Yeah.
Lisa, are you by grants, are you thinking of things that would reduce their costs for internet? Can you give an example?
Sure, I don't know what grants are out there for this topic, but if you were to get a chunk of money and it was kept in a pool to help supplement the monthly payments of folks who couldn't otherwise afford high-speed internet.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So, and that's actually what Keene Housing did in a way. They tapped into some of the CARES Act funding to support the internet bills of their residents. So I guess.
Once the grant is obtained, you have to make some promises about how it's administered in the aftermath. So there's a little bit of legwork that would be required, and just making sure that CCI it promises to be cooperative in that process would be helpful.
Tom, did you have a comment on this?
Yeah, I'm just wondering how this is going to get rolled into a contract or an agreement with one of the providers. You know, it sounds like, you know, these grant things are going to come and go over the years, I'm sure. So I'm not sure, you know, how to really roll this into, you know, the initial negotiations, which I think a lot of us are kind of in the middle of at this point.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the answer is right now.
In part, it's just a service level agreement. You know, they say that they will they'll partner with the towns. They have this contract with the town of Troy, and we have to give them some information. They have to give us some information. We stay in partnership over time, and there has to be a certain turnaround time that's acceptable when we ask for something or when they ask for something. So it doesn't have to be specific to grants. It could be very broad. Anytime we ask for information on anything, there has to be an SLA. So then it's customer service, which isn't on here, by the way, but I know it comes up a lot.
Yeah, where the customer is the municipality.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's one that could be added here.
I think something else that might be open for negotiation in the contract relative to the issue of the cost of service, whether it be for low income or for regular customers, is whether or not they're going to be adding the Federal Universal Service Fund fee to the costs of the contract over and above whatever the service is, the infrastructure recovery fee is. You know, what other add-ons are going to be added to bills that can inflate it? The Universal Service Fund does not require that telecommunications providers pass on the fees that they are charged by that they have to provide to the federal government, but most internet service providers do pass it on, and it's mysterious as to how they arrive at what the amount is and what the use of the funds turns out to be.
It seems like
And-
that's.
And the point of the Universal Service Fund is it's supposed to bring internet telecommunication services universally to the rural areas of America for schools and libraries, at least.
Okay, and that's kind of a pricing gap with the other consumer pricing, it sounds like, at least as far as the agreement, although we might encourage people to check the RFP responses to see if it was listed there.
Well, their current, this new improved pricing that they're offering has no fees other than the town by town user fee, and they're very explicit about that. But again, it comes back to what happens down the road. If we don't have a contractual protection in there, then they can change that at a whim anytime they feel like. So it would be a real good thing to lay that out.
Yeah, not to make a deviate too much, but I'm just pulled up one of the websites created. This one's for the town of Dublin, and I know it breaks down the pricing for them.
Right.
It's not,
That's their current pricing right now. But the pricing that they are talking to the towns that are in negotiation with them now simplifies all this and reduces these prices substantially. So that 50 megabit tier, for instance, is down to 45. And of that 45, $10 in our case is the user fee.
Yeah, so some discussions of add-on fees probably needs to be in the contract relative to pricing. I'm a homeowner in Troy, but I live in New Jersey and work in New Jersey. And my ISP here, I have $9 of add-on fees that are quote government related, and nobody has any idea as to where those funds end up and what they're used for. But the price is always advertised without the $9 when they market.
Yeah, my concern with the promotional pricing from CCI, their newer pricing structure was that those fees were not included in what they were advertising, but that they would be included in your bill. So I don't know if you've heard differently. So that they look better than they actually are, but I don't know if that's true or not.
That's my understanding as well.
Yeah, so that was, as I look closer, not quite as good.
good points to bring up, folks. Thank you. So I think we're getting almost to 10 minutes left in this kind of marathon session. How about we pick out just one of these to discuss next, and then decide on what to do next. Of those last kind of 5 on the list, are people really interested in one over the other?
I think number 10.
Anyone else want to hear that as well, or a different one?
I would second number 10 as well.
Yeah, I definitely am. And I know that there was some difference between the Chesterfield contract and some of the later contracts that came out as what the town's benefit would be from getting some of the grants. So we're looking at trying to get the Chesterfield language versus the other language.
Okay, so there's 2 parts in here. I think the first clause is the easier one. Can someone answer like how that's revisited? How often the provider adjusts the bond recovery fee down?
I can tell you what I saw in reviewing the contracts if you want. What was proposed originally was that those end user fees were fixed. And so it was, it was $11.50 for some towns, is $8 for others, whatever it was fixed and it wasn't changing. The reason I was seeing that, sorry, does somebody else have a comment? Okay, yeah, one of the reasons I was concerned about that was that if the town did get the grant money, the fees were based on not having the grant money. And so, okay, now your bond gets paid off or half of it gets paid off by the grant. So this cost of servicing the bond goes down, but the town doesn't see any benefit to that. Whereas with the Chesterfield model, the Chesterfield language actually does have, it's every 2 years that it would be renegotiated or reevaluated, and it would be adjusted based on the cost of actually servicing the bond. So if you end up paying off half of your bond, the cost of servicing that bond would go down based on the reduction in interest. So there could be a benefit to the end users in terms of, a reduction in that fee. So that was what I was looking at, and why I think that the Chesterfield language seemed to better protect the town. And the end user fee was a not to exceed number rather than a fixed number.
My understanding is it's not possible to pay off your bond early, but the bond payments do diminish over time as the principal goes down. And Rob Custer has told us they tend to be adjusting them every 2 to 3 years, and the drop seems to be about 50 cents when they do that. But there's nothing in our service agreement about that.
It's interesting. I wonder how the grants would work then. If we've got to take out the bond for the full amount and we get a grant, does that mean that we just have to sit on that money if we can't pay the grant back?
Yeah, that's a problem. Once you sign that service agreement, and get your bond, you're kind of stuck, and it's hard to use any grant money that becomes available. And it was suggested to us that we wait to sign that service agreement until the last minute.
That's kind of what I was thinking. I wanted to make sure we didn't fall into that trap as well.
Does anyone know if there are grants that can basically make bond payments? Is that a thing?
I don't think so, but I think there are grants that can be given to CCI to reduce the recovery fee.
That happened in Fitzwilliam.
They
We
stopped
received,
charging the $9.50 to our people.
Fitzwilliam received some RDUF funds through CCI's application for us, and it reduced the cost of the bond, and it also reduced that infrastructure recovery fee. But once that bond payment money happens, I don't think any of that could occur.
So that has to be, CCI would have to obtain that before the bond is finalized. Is that right?
That's the way I understand it, yes.
No, the RDOF money is paid out by the FCC over 10 years. We're in the same boat, but they factor it into their financial model.
Right. But the deal happens with CCI. They're the ones that will be getting
Correct.
that money.
Correct. They're getting the money from the FCC, but they're getting it over 10 years. They don't get it all in one big whack.
It's actually, from my perspective, I didn't feel like it was a great deal for CCI, honestly, because of the long payback.
Well, it's better than nothing.
That's true. And Fitzwilliam did directly benefit from that $217,000 being taken off our cost.
Yeah, I'm curious how the grant is going to work though, because the deadline for the effective date of the grant that's working its way through the Senate right now is July 21st, I think it is. It's after the date for submitting a bond application. So I think I need to maybe follow up with Denise and find out how that's really going to work for any towns going through this process right now.
I believe You can submit your application, and you're still free to change your mind until you take the money. Maybe someone else knows more. In other words, you can reduce the amount of your bond after you've already applied, I believe.
Okay. Okay. So you apply, but then you have the opportunity to reduce the principal on that based on, grant funding if it becomes available.
That's my understanding, although that window is not going to be very large, but it might help that upcoming date for that grant.
Okay. Yeah. I'll check in with Denise and also check with our bond attorney and find out what the deal is going to be for that.
Okay, so this helps me understand why Renell had us put in there that the $233,000 would be raised through a bond or other means if they become available, right? Okay.
Right, and it says, and your warrant also said not to exceed. It doesn't mean you're actually going to bond that amount.
Ours didn't say not to exceed.
Yeah. Ours is a fixed value as well.
That's interesting because we got our language adjusted by Renell.
Yeah. So you didn't catch that in ours, I guess.
The Troys and Fitzgibbons were very different from one another, and we were using the same person at the same time.
It's a little frustrating because you'd think that it would all be kind of down pat by now, as many towns as she's worked through,
But maybe it's not as particular as we all think it is.
There's some really good, there's some really important topics in here. And in our region, there were quite a lot of FCC awards through the RDOF program. So makes sense. Everyone wants to understand that. There is a link in our resources page where you can see if there were bidders for your community or part of your community. Let's pause here since we're at time. I think there's a couple of these items we did really well on, and that there's others that maybe we had more questions than answers, which is okay. And SWRBC is willing to host another one of these events to wrap this up. And my question is, what's a good time to do that? Is it 2 weeks from now, or do we have a little more time? Can someone give me a sense?
I just heard from Jeff that we might have our contract by Wednesday, maybe. I think coming together with this group at the very front end is incredibly helpful. So I'd be in favor of 2 weeks from now.
Wouldn't want to push it any longer than that. That's for sure.
I'd be okay with tomorrow.
Well, what if I put a poll out for like between 1 and 2 weeks to folks? Okay, and I'll if you want to connect with each other, please leave a message in the chat. I'll keep the meeting running a little longer because you're obviously welcome to connect with each other directly. At this point, I won't fill out the parking lot yet. Obviously, there's topics we haven't covered at all, and there's some that probably warrant more discussion. Does anyone have comments on this session or suggestions for the next one?
To what degree would it be useful to have some of the attorneys that are working on these agreements pitch in? I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but it seems like it might be a good thing.
It's a great.
I mean, my gut reaction is there would be, could be a good idea. They're definitely welcome from our perspective.
Well, yeah, they're going to want us to have a bake sale to pay them, but you know.
I think someone from the state bond bank might be more useful than a bond lawyer like Rennell.
So I'm thinking actually that it would be very beneficial for one of the lawyers to be on, because if you think about how they charge their fees, it's about how many questions we ask them individually. And if they're answering all of the questions in bulk, it saves them time. Right?
Yeah, but who are they going to charge for it?
Well,
They'll charge all of us less because we are individually.
Right, they'll charge all of us less. That's not in their interest.
but consolidated is covering the cost of a bond lawyer if your provider is consolidated.
Thanks for the reminder.
Even if not, those costs get rolled into the bond, which then gets paid by the provider.
Well, I can't think of a silver bullet idea for this situation. Also, I know that the bond attorney it might not be the only attorney you need or want in this process. She might not be able to answer a lot of these questions.
We're dealing with both the town's usual contract attorney and the bond attorney. They're both looking at it.
Can you guys say who you have for town council?
Upton and Hatfield.
I'm just curious because I don't know what kind of experience our council will have had with this specific contract in other contexts.
Yeah, we actually had a contract attorney that we brought in as well, John Radigan, in addition to the bond contract or the bond counsel.
Okay, so I don't think we have a list in our broadband implementation guide, but Upton and Hatfield was mentioned. Was it John Radigan?
Yes.
And I know some communities didn't engage anyone outside of bond counsel. Okay. Well, on the idea of engaging attorneys in the next session, I'll plan to talk about it internally here to see if I have any suggestions, and I'll share those when I reach out to everyone with the poll for the next meeting.